hopefully that doesn't reflect on me. Notice who I'm worried about. Me. You can't hear me? Gee whiz. Can y'all hear me? Come over here closer. I prepped this lesson for a young man that came by my house yesterday, and he's been here before. Oddly enough, the first time he ever came, it was the same day. We were going to have the once-a-month meal. I don't see him here this morning, but I feel, well, part of this would be directed at him, okay? The other part would just be for us and our benefit. I tried to combine this in both directions. And what started this is I saw a quotation this week, and I went and I investigated this quotation. And let me read the quotation to you right quick. And, well, let me back up just a little bit. This guy became like a Greek general for the city of Athens. And this is before it was known as Greece. And he was a fairly wealthy man there in Athens. And because of his wealth, people looked up to him, and he was a fairly smart guy. And he's the very first guy to actually give us a historical record of some of the events that happened around Greece, those sort of things. So what I'm going to read is a quote from about 2,500 years ago. Now that precedes, what's the name on the church here? The Church of, that precedes him by about 500 years. Okay. Well, when were the last of the New Testament books written? Wasn't it about 500 years before the New Testament or before Christ came? Somewhere in this general area. It's pretty close in these areas. So, I don't know how far back I need to go for you. Before. Well, Jesus came about 500 years before this man wrote this quotation. And this quotation was written about the same time as the last of the prophets was written. If I have my timelines correct. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. So anyway, I'm going to try to pronounce this. I've heard it 100 times and I never get it right, but I think it's the Thucydides. It's spelled Thucydides. Thucydides. Okay? And remember, he's the first guy to write down a historical document about this. And it's from the Peloponnesian Wars. Okay? And if y'all don't remember that, that was when Athens was at war with Sparta. Okay? Pretty tough set of wars. They lasted a long, long time. So this is the quote. He says, "So little pains do most people take in the investigation of truth, accepting readily the first story that comes to mind or comes to hand." Now let me read this one more time. "So little pains do most people take in the investigation of truth, accepting readily the first story that comes to hand." If anybody remembers, in previous Sundays, we were reading from John 8. And what does Christ do from about the middle part of John 8 on? In fact, the first part of John 8, he takes them to task. And this is a reflection of what Thucydides says. How much did they really study, let's say the Pharisees, how much did they really study into what Scripture was speaking to them about? Because what did Christ do in that 8th chapter? He started to take them to task for their misunderstanding. Misunderstanding led to things like pride. Pride can lead us astray pretty quickly if you really stop to think about it. Pride in appearance, pride in the way you do things, just pride, period. I got a lot of money. I'm prideful. So, In this, I'll read directly from what I read or have written here. He says, how guilty are we of what Thucydides said approximately 2,500 years ago? How many times, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody. What did you say he did? What did you say she did? And then you repeat it, and then you come to find out that it was the direct opposite of what you had heard. How many times has that happened to you? It's happened to me more times than I've probably lost count on that. And what do the apostles teach us about this word G-O-S-S-I-P? Gossip. Idle gossip can hurt things, can't it? Yeah. What happens if you've gossiped about somebody and it gets back to them and they confront you? What happens then? What happens if you've told 20 people about this particular incident? And you know full well you should have kept your mouth shut about this. Gossip maybe falls into the realm of, you just shouldn't say it. It may be falsehood. Someone embellishes on the truth just a little bit. What do we get in news media a lot? We get a lot of things that are said, but how many of us take the time to actually investigate? Is this what actually happened? The news media is guilty of changing one word in a sentence, and it changes the meaning of everything. Everything. All we got to do is look around at our present society, and we can see it at work, in action. And who does it hurt? Well, the people that say it. They may not realize it at the moment, but it hurts just about everybody, one way or the other. So the truth of the matter is, know the truth and speak the truth. So to know the truth, this is where we're going from on this. How many of you in here can tell me what the dictionary definition of the word propitiate is? We've heard propitiation a lot, but what is it to propitiate? Anybody in here want to volunteer what propitiate means? In place of? Karen says in place of. Well, let's look at the dictionary definition of it. It's a transient verb, and a transient verb means it has a direct object. There's an object for this statement, or for this particular word. Propitiate, to gain or regain the favor or goodwill of. To gain the favor. Hebrews uses that word propitiation. Who is it that gave us and actually took the whole thing through to the end? He gave us the propitiation, and then we live the benefits of that. Who did that? Jesus the Christ, didn't he? So, another word that's used as a substitute for propitiate is the word appease. Appease. Well, I was thinking, appease. I kind of know what that word means, but let's investigate a little further as to what appease means. Appease, again, is a transitive verb. It has a direct object. It says to pacify, to conciliate, to cause to subside, to bring to a state of peace or quiet or calm. Propitiation. Now you got a little better meaning or understanding of what the word propitiation means? I always just thought, well, he hung on a cross for us. He paid the price for what? For what? What is it that human beings do a lot? For sin. Okay? And sin, in its easiest to remember form or meaning, is rebellion. I ain't going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it my way. Forget what you told me. To appease, pacify, conciliate, to cause to subside. The same thing as propitiate. So now, you've heard me say this before, and remember, this is the part of the lesson that I had constructed for the benefit of that one young man that I would hope would have showed up this morning. But nevertheless, what is our purpose? What is our purpose when we're born to the moment that we die? What is our purpose? We have no purpose. No one has any idea. Serve God. But what's the purpose of serving? Huh? Well, let's put it this way. Me and Debbie went over to I forget the name of that place over there in Harlingen to eat. Had this nice waiter, good-looking fella. We gave him our order. Let's just say that I ordered a steak. What would I do if this servant showed up and he gave me a hamburger when I ordered a steak? Hey, come here. Yeah, I ordered a steak. Oh, I'm sorry. He comes back and he brings me a plate of French fries. Wait, I ordered a steak, not French fries, not a hamburger. Oh, okay, I'll be back in a minute. And he just never shows up again. What kind of servant is that? Would he get a tip from you? See how easy it is to illustrate what a servant is? Servant, a noun, person, place, or a thing. It says one that serves others. How many people do we have in this church that serve others? Well, if you're in the church pew, at the absolute minimum, you should be willing to serve any one of us in whatever capacity that you can do. So if we look at Christ, how much of a servant was he? Especially the last 3 years of his life, 3 to 4 years of his life. In fact, he was already serving by the time he was 12. How good a servant was he?
The greatest.
Absolutely. I'll go one step further. He was the ultimate servant. He was willing to give up his life for others. There have been other human beings in life through history that have done such things. Some of them have been very good Christians that have suffered from that. Servant, noun, one that serves others. A servant appears 824 times in the New American Standard, 746 times in the Old Testament, and 78 times in the New Testament. Now, a lot of times the word servant in the Old Testament would not necessarily apply to Christ, but it talked about people that were servants in one way or another. How do you think King David looked at himself as far as being a servant to God? What happened to King David when he looked down on Bathsheba? Who was he serving then? And think of what the eye saw, what it turned into at the end of the day. Turned into what happened to Uriah? He was beyond killed. He was purposely murdered. That goes directly against one of the 10 Commandments. I use that to illustrate a biblical principle that was in here. So when you read that story the next time, or you hear that story, think about this. What happens to us when we see something like that? Well, you think about the heartbreak that would have happened with Uriah. Think about the total embarrassment for the king and Bathsheba. So, in that, if you have a servant that comes to your table and he repeatedly will not bring you what you ask for, there's a word that you might put in this. Could you trust this guy to bring you the right stuff? Hey, I want some ketchup. He brings you a plate full of mayonnaise. Wait a minute. That's not what I asked for. I gave you a specific instruction. Why didn't you follow it? Well, is the excuse, I didn't hear you? What would be the excuse? What excuse do we have with this instruction manual right here that tells us how to be a good servant? What would drive us to be a good servant? Maybe some of us don't like to work very much, but wait a minute. Do we just automatically, once you've been baptized, do you automatically got a get out of jail free card? I'm going straight to heaven. I don't care what I can do after this. Servant. One of the things about a servant is the word trust. Can we be trusted? Again, this was directed towards that young man that didn't show up this morning. But trust. Trust, trust, trust. And we're not talking about one of these trusts, it's a money shield. We're talking about the word trust. Trust, again, by definition, is a noun. That means it's a thing. Person, place, or a thing. Trust, an intangible thing. You can't touch it, but it's a noun. How can that be? A noun. It says, assured reliance on the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. When you're driving down the road and you're approaching a red light and you step on the brake pedal, what kind of trust do you have? You trust that that car is going to slow down because the brakes are going to do their job. When I still lived in Waco, I had a 1964 Studebaker station wagon. Real neat car, really liked it. But then the master cylinder went bad. And I thought I could get by with, having a bad, weak brake pedal. Well, one day, the old brakes just didn't work. And I went sailing right through a red light. And the first thing I tried to do was open the door and put my foot out and slow this car down. That car no more knew that I put my foot on the ground than the man in the moon. Several other times, I drove that car around for about 4 months with no brakes. It had a standard shift transmission, and I would downshift and slow it down, turn the key off, and all this sort of thing. Well, one day, I pulled up, and I just about come to a stop. I was coasted out just a little too far, and another car didn't see me, and we exchanged a little clip of 2 bumpers. Scared me half to death. Guess how long it took me to fix that brake system after that? About 1 day. I drove that car home, and I'm fixing the brakes. This is nuts, driving around with no brakes. So next time you go to put the brakes on and stop at a red light or stop sign, what happens if someone pulls out in front of you and you ain't got no brakes? You trust those brakes. What are these things? What are the admonitions in this book? What the advice it gives us? Put the brakes on. What's going on up here? What's going on up here? For us men, when we see a pretty girl, I'm just as guilty as anybody. Hey, look away. Quit your thinking. I'll never forget it. Kerry was up here in the pulpit one day. Me and him were walking into the Walmart over here just down the road a little bit. And this girl came out, beautiful woman, dressed all slinky and whatnot. And me and Kerry both were looking. And I happened to look over and look at Kerry, and I said, "What you looking at?" Kerry repeated this episode up here in the pulpit. I don't know if you remember it or not. But he just kind of went. He knew exactly. I didn't have to say anything else. Yeah, I'll be seated.
Yeah, I think you just gave a perfect illustration, but didn't talk too much about it. When that car gets stopped, you put your foot up to your part. However, there was a higher power, that vehicle rolling forward, that took over. And, we can't trust ourselves. We have to trust in Christ, that higher power, that God, making changes in it to be able to have us trust Him, not ourselves.
Absolutely.
Just like putting your foot up, your car still keep on going.
That's the point in telling the story. Well, where do you put your trust? How much can you be trusted? And that's the point behind me telling the story about me and Kerry walking in that Walmart. I was just as guilty of doing what he was doing. And none of us are beyond that. That's the thing. You're just, for lack of a better term, you're poking your own eyeballs if you think you can do that without the restraints that are pushed here, put in here.
He's not married and you are.
Yes, but we're still men. So, and that's no excuse. The same thing happens to women. Don't kid yourself. I'm not, that's just, and I'm not trying to be gross or anything like that. But that's one of the things that we have to think about is the consequences of what we do. Because that's one of the reasons why you have your posterior sitting in these seats right now. We look down the road at the consequences of our actions. And if we don't, well, we should be thinking about that. Okay? Because our actions do have consequences. Now, where do our actions come from? Your heart doesn't do your thinking for you. Remember the lesson I gave on what's the most valuable thing that you own? You own it. No one else owns it. God gave it to you. It's your ability to choose. You're a free will individual. Okay? You and you alone should become the guardian of your heart. Well, how do you learn to be a guardian of your heart? Comes right here. Go back to Thucydides, what he said. How many people will open that Bible up and actually study the thing? Oh, I kind of know it. Can you defend yourself when someone comes up and says, oh, you guys over in the Church of Christ, you don't know what you're talking about. You're too strict. You're no better than the Pharisees were. Well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. What are we taught about that? Christ even had a word in there. I can't put my finger or my mind on the exact piece of scripture for that. But he said everything. You need to obey everything. How else can you be trusted? It's a huge word, but it doesn't get talked about enough. So, we've kind of covered all this business about a servant. And in Mark 10 and verse 45, and I'm reading from the New American Standard, he says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served. He did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. To serve. Who did Jesus come to serve? Was it one or was it two entities? Or could it have been three entities? Let me ask you, who do you serve? Who's preeminent in your life that you serve? Who's the most important individual in your life? Huh?
To serve God, to be obedient to God first and foremost.
Absolutely. So, serve means you turn into a servant. So who do you serve first? And this is something that's built into all of us, and we can't get around it. How greedy are we about ourselves? Greedy is a pretty good word on that. So we have to be careful about how we wind up using this knowledge that we have. If we're told to do something and we do it anyway, who are we serving? You're not, you're serving self. You're putting yourself in front of God. Okay? So, what did Christ do? I suggest to you he had a minimum of three people, or three not people, but entities that he served. And the first one would have been God the Father. Okay? The second one would have been, and this is, I guess it's a tie. You can call it a toss-up. But I would say that he served God for pleasure, for God's pleasure. Not necessarily pleasure, but what's the proper word for that? For seeking God's approval. Okay? But then it comes a toss-up. Do I serve the people of the world? You think about this. If Christ had failed and not gone on that cross, let's say he would have conceded to Pilate or even the Pharisees, would we even be here? So as a servant, he's serving three entities. He's serving God, he's serving himself, and he served us. And one of the things he did is, in terms of the service that he gave to us, he wanted us to think. And we're not talking about thinking about the woman walking up in the parking lot. We're talking about thinking about what God has told us in our behaviors. Make the right choices. There's a lot of words that I could use to continue this with. And what did Christ do? And next week we'll cover this in a lot more depth, the end of the 8th chapter of John. I'll reread Mark 10:45. It's, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. There's this service. But wait a minute. Here's a word here. And I'll illustrate this with a true story. For a couple of years, I was working for the De Leon brothers over in McAllen. One day I walked in, and the older brother, Joel, was white as a sheet. I said, what's going on? And he says, man, I just got a phone call. I can't believe this phone call. What phone call? What are you talking about? And he says, I just had someone call up. They named the name of my kids when they were birthed, and they named my wife and the name of her birth, and they named where she was right at that moment. I said, what's going on? He says, they demanded $50,000 ransom by Friday, or all three of them, they'd be dead. And they told him, don't make a phone call. Don't alert the authorities. Well, that's the first thing Joel did, is he called the FBI. I didn't see it. I was in the back working, but the FBI showed up and they put recorders on his phone. As far as I knew, they kept him on there for a long, long time. But the guy finally called back on Friday and said, well, we're going to murder your wife. Nothing happened. But with that $50,000, what would you call that? To demand to take away what could have happened to his wife and his kids. By the way, his kid was a Border Patrol agent at that point in time. And they knew that. What would that be called? Ransom. Okay? Can anybody tell me what ransom means? It's used right there in Scripture in Mark, isn't it? Let's think about this. Let's go to the definition and reread Scripture. It says ransom, it's a noun, person, place, or thing. A consideration paid or demanded for the release of someone or something from captivity. Well, let me ask you, what's ever one of us in this place captive to? Me and Carrie walking up the driveway there, or the parking lot, and here comes this beautiful woman. Minds go nuts. What are we captive to? S-I-N. Rebellion. Okay? Serve self. Another part of ransom is now it's used as a verb. It's an action. Okay? It says to deliver especially from sin or its penalty. Well, what is the penalty of sin? What do we know about that? It's right here. Death. Okay? Death of what? If you sin, you get a lightning bolt, strikes you dead right there on the spot. Yeah. You don't get to go to the happy place. And I don't mean that to be just playing on words. Second part of this is to free from captivity or punishment by paying a price. Well, how do we pay this price? How do we escape this ransom? One, we answer the gospel call. We get baptized. But what happens after that? Do you call Aunt Grace? Why do you think I use that word grace? What is grace? Grace is there as an out for us. But should we abuse grace? How many times can you call Aunt Grace to come pick you up from, let's say, a nightclub you've been in? Pretty soon Aunt Grace is going to tell you, you got to straighten up your act. Quit doing that. Abusing grace. You're only fooling yourself when you abuse it. And I include myself in that statement. So to read again about ransom. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that, how much was his life worth? $1 million? $1 billion? $1 trillion? The whole earth? What was it worth? It was worth more than we can put a price on, actually. Only the two active participants really know the worth of that. So in this business that I read about the necessities, I'll reread this again. And let's make the application towards the thought or the thinking of the Bible. It says, so little pains do most people take in the investigation of truth, accepting readily the first story that comes to hand. How many thousands of years have been used in study of this? Especially when someone spends most of their entire life in the study of this. How do we measure up on the study of this thing? A few minutes a week? Maybe every other day? Something like that. Only you can use your own, you use your own yardstick on that. But how is it reflected in the study here? Well, it's reflected or showing by how you behave and the decisions you make. Okay? Are your decisions, especially the big decisions in your life, are they made based off these principles? Well, I don't think you have to think very far into this to see in our society these days as to how much is anybody actually studying this. I got this video from one of my friends who's been in here several times. Had some guy, I forget who he is, all he talked about for an hour and a half was money. And how money is the most important thing. I'm just going, how could you send this to me? You know? I haven't said anything to him. I've been really running it around in my mind as to how to reply to that. So, if you would, turn over to Ecclesiastes. Let's just look at what it says in the first chapter. Who do we think? Who wrote Ecclesiastes? Who's the author? Solomon. Okay. Who was his father? King David. Okay. So, with the thought of actually reading this to gain knowledge, not just of a bunch of words, but actual application. Let's start in verse 1. This is Ecclesiastes 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Verse 3. What advantage does man have in all his work? What advantage does a man have in all his work which he does under the sun? When you die, all the work that you've done in your lifetime, where does it go? What does it do for you? It's one of those things. What's the most important thing you take with you whenever you die? What about your conscience? That's all you get. That's all you get. And there's a judgment that comes with that. So I pose these questions here. When you read this, what does it generate in your mind? Does it generate an unanswerable question, or does it drive you to examine yourself and then make application for what Scripture says? Verse 4, listen to this one. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. There are some of us in here that you might call short-timers. We don't have that much time left, not like we did when we were in our 20s. I've said this before. One time I think I was in my 30s before I started figuring this out. If you take a year, how many days are in what we call a calendar year? 365, and every fourth year there's 366 days. Okay? Do the multiplication. It's real easy. From the time you're born, and let's say you live to be 80 years old, do the math. You'll come to find out that there ain't that many days. What happens if you're 75 years old and you know for certain you're going to die when you're 80 years old? 5 times 365. We'll just round it off. 5 times 400. You got less than 2,000 days. You're less than 2,000 days to live. A lot of people, when you're young, I got all the time in the world. I think that might have been what happened when my 14-year-old friend Douglas Beck got killed. Didn't even have a chance at anything. He just, in the dark, he ran into the back end of a big bobtail trailer and took his head off. Life was over with right there. So do a little bit of calculating there. Then generations here. What has my generation done for us? I've come from the generation of sex, drug, and rock and roll. That we were the spawn of the people that had some of these influences that came in directly after World War II, but they were active even before World War II in the 1930s, 1920s. And one of their direct objectives is we have to get rid of this instruction manual. We got to get rid of it if we're going to achieve our goal. And that goal, at its absolute core, is our enemy, Satan. What do? What was it? Was it Friday, I think? Some guy decided in New York City, decided he's going to give away some sort of a game thing in New York City. Did y'all see some of the fights that came out of all that? What in the world is going on that many people would show up for a thing you can buy for a couple of $300-400? I don't know how many thousands of people showed up for this. What kind of reflection on our society is that? In that they just throw this thing out. Most of them have never even picked one of these up. And if they've heard of it, I don't need that. But apparently you think, if you're here, you think you need something to do with this. Next week I'll continue in here because the ecclesiastical writer, a little further down, he says, I want to know what life is all about. I want to know the good things and I want to know the bad things. And he lived it. But the whole idea in writing all this down is get you to think, not just wander around and eat and sleep. Apply it, because the application is good for you and it's good for me. It's good for every one of us. We'll stop there. Any questions, anything I've said that's wrong, please let me know.